I have just been talking about this for 40 or 50 years, and I wondered how to come at it with you in this framework of developing your psychic potential. So I want to follow a very tried and true public speaking rule. I've heard this way back in, I think it must have been at least graded school or high school, certainly. And the rule is to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then tell them what you've told them. I want to open with some general observations about Edgar Cayce. And then I want to illustrate a lot of the kinds of extrasensory perception that Dad had that are shown up. Some background for how he got that way, as I understand it. And then I wanted finally to conclude with an emphasis that is stressed again and again and again in the Edgar Cayce readings on the nature of psychic perception, psychic ability. I wish I could have picked up, and I went all over the building this morning trying to find a copy of The Little Prince. I saw it on television the other day, Saturday, and was absolutely enthralled. Alan J. Lerner, who did the book and so forth on it, has been with us in many ways for a long, long time, and a friend. And I wrote him this morning and told him how delighted I was. And when it came out, The Little Prince, it was simply panned by the critics, and it's never gotten off the ground. I don't know what happened to it. I don't know whether you've ever even seen it or not. It was a major film with some major stars in it, but it just didn't seem to gel. And I told him that it convinced me that both the critics and the American public didn't know what they really needed or wanted to see. In this Little Prince, that classic, as you remember, the author fell in a plane in the northern part of Africa in the desert, and he had some visions, and this was one of his visions. And this little boy came, and then the boy meets a fox. And the fox gave him a very special secret. It was all written out, and that's what I wanted to read for you. But it speaks to the point that you and I frequently never see the things that have real meaning. We see them with our heart sometimes, but most of the time we're missing the real part of life, unfortunately. And so we keep coming back and coming back until we begin to sense and see the true reality, not of matter and this thing around us, but of the mind and the heart and the spirit of man, which is where it's really at. I think I knew such a man. And I think we should look at Edgar Cayce's material in a general way in the beginning. This first point that I want to make about him has to do with the fact that he seemed to be touching a kind of universal source of knowledge. The universal nature of his psychic data. Where did he get it? And he talks about this universality. And he has a great deal to say about the development of psychic ability and about psychic perception And all of that material has been magnificently put together. I imagine Herb has already mentioned these to you, but recently, as part of our library series, there are 2 new books out. One's on psychic development and one on psychic awareness. And they're all the readings that Edgar Cayce gave answering questions about his own psychic ability and about the psychic gifts of many people who came to him. Many trying to get rid of them, and many trying to develop them. He's speaking here of his own psychic gifts. And he says this, the entity, and he's speaking of himself, and he's speaking of a particular incarnation, which I'll mention to you in just a moment, where he developed this psychic ability, because that was his answer as to where he got it, was he developed it in several incarnations in the earth. And in one of these incarnations, the entity turned within and there found his maker, as is the promise to every soul today. And then he goes on to talk about our need for going within. That's the whole thrust of my venture inward. That is the whole thrust of our emphasis on prayer and meditation in A.R.E. This finding and awakening this spiritual part of ourselves, which he says is easy. Now he goes on to describe, as the entity sought to aid others, there were those opportunities given through the groups that gathered about. He's talking about a past life. Thus, in the application of that desire and the will to try, thus there entered in or came that influence which today, when turning within, enables the entity to give that which is the measure of the faith of the seeker. It was his turning within, and then his desire to help others accomplish this. Each and every relationship in man's experience is relative according to purpose, desire, will, and hope. They are then of a universal nature, and this is the emphasis point here. Not of an entity, not of a personality, not of other than the will to do God's bidding. Not limited to a particular entity or guide or control in this sense, or particular source. But because of this turning within and freeing himself, he was able to reach out to a more than of a universal nature. We could say it this way: he that doeth the will of the Father, in desire and purpose and hope, doeth not then of himself, but through the Spirit of him who has given, that in him, God, ye live and move and have thy being. Then as to its authenticity, as to its truth, as to its helpfulness in the present application of the abilities, not only of this man, but every soul that seeks to know God's way, for what purpose do you enter into the Holy of Holies? What is the purpose of a psychic activity of some kind? Now, Edgar Cayce sought to serve, and that's the focus of that. In another sense, let me read you another quote on that. In obtaining this information, someone asking, does this body gain its information from the director or from the body directed to? The person is asking there, does he get it from the person that is giving the suggestion, or does he get it from the person on whom he's giving the reading? From the subconscious forces which become universal. by the natural laws governing the relativity of all force. In other words, he's speaking to this universal attunement, the possibility of it. Now, he runs into another fascinating statement here. In the very beginning of this book, in the prologue, it gives an opening for an Edgar Cayce reading. And listen carefully as I read. In giving the interpretation of the records, and he's giving a life reading on this person, these we choose from same with the desire that this may prove a helpful experience for the entity. This is a sensitive who could choose in the process of picking up psychic information. Not that just handed back whatever was perceived, but was choosing what would be helpful for the person for whom he was giving this information. The power of selection is a quality of the Edgar Cayce readings. And then this one, his definition of psychic that occurs again and again and again. And I'll just read a phrase from one of the readings. Psychic is of the soul. You are at the headquarters of one of the few psychical research organizations in the world that stresses and focuses on the spiritual importance of psychic activity. Defines it in terms of a quickening or awakening of the spiritual nature. You think of psychic frequently in terms of the phenomena and the occult. Edgar Cayce thinks of it in the Greek term of the psyche, or the spiritual nature of man, which when quickened and awakened with the right purposes is an activity of the soul, the spiritual self of the soul itself. Now, there's a fascinating one here too on a phrase that my brother, it was the first one that I heard coin it, though we talk about it frequently. And that is something that is difficult to come by unless you study and work with the readings over a long period of time. What is called the internal consistency. What he said in one place, he does not deny and change in another. You feel the flow of the concept of basic ideals, ideas and purposes and statements running through for 43 years. Not changing and jumping around, but or talking about this concept of something and then defining it in a different way somewhere else, but the flow, the consistency. I want to pick up just one example of this. This is a reading that he gave on himself, and the so-called work readings are on what he should do with the readings, what he should do with his life. And he kept giving them on himself, trying to find out all of his life. Tried to get one and try to work on it a while, and it wasn't easy. It demanded a great deal of him. And those are called work readings. And there's a booklet in there that you can get, which would be well worth taking a look at, called Highlights from the Work Readings, that Bob Adrian's put together, an excellent collection. There's a big fat volume up in the library of all the work readings. And one of the things you should look carefully at as you deal with any psychic or deal with yourself and your own psychic perception, do you follow your own information? Does a psychic follow their own information? In my opinion, no psychic or sensitive should be telling somebody else what to do unless they're willing to do it themselves first. And this is a very basic concept. Now here, I do want to give you an illustration. In 1911, Edgar Cayce began to talk about, in his own reading, about the will, subject to the will of the mental self of the individual man. The development of each individual has this in itself. He stresses this will as being a factor which we must awaken. Our ability to make choice. We are reminded immediately of the old Deuteronomy, 30th chapter. There is set before thee, O Moses, admonitions. This day, life and death, good and evil, light and darkness, choose thou. If there's one thing you and I object to doing most of the time is making a choice. If we can get somebody to make it for us, make up our minds for us, tell us what to do, then we can go and do it. And that has created some very interesting institutions in this country, around the world, in fact. The minds of all matter, it is the mental capacity of all matter, this will, or the invisible action of matter on the mind in the individual itself. That was in 1911. Let me read you one that comes out of, for each soul is in accord or tune with what it has done about, with its desire, its will, in relationships to that which is creative in its essence. This will is running right on through. Now, that wasn't but 25 years later. But, and I use this only as an illustration, the factor and the importance, the need for awakening and quickening the will, the internal consistency here of the education readings is just astounding. Look and see. Take any idea. Take his material on reincarnation, 2,500 readings. The consistency of the laws that govern, that he came up with, is absolutely amazing, the way it works. And it was his observations of the laws, you see, that are important, not who people were, but how the laws work. For that's what you and I can apply and begin to work with, if this be the way the world's running. Now, where did he get all this ability? We kept asking him, and his answers were worse than what he was doing. For he said that he started working with this way back in the beginning, in the coming of man into the earth, and that he ended up in two very periods of many incarnations. He gave himself about 8 or 9, I think, where he developed psychic ability. And he had used it helpfully and constructively, and he brought it over into the present. Now, one of these you'll find, and this is why we produce the material and why we're doing so blasted much in Egypt, constantly trying. We are right this minute back of a dig that is going on right in front of the Sphinx Temple. It's taken me 3 years to get it going again. We got it, permits for it, and then lost them, and we got them again, and they're digging. Now, this is not the digging right under the right paw, but it's digging out in front where something's got to go. We may or may not run into something. This is done by the Antiquities Department with our money, but it's being done right now. If you suddenly see me disappear before tomorrow morning, you know where I went. They cabled me and I took off. Or jetted over, I mean just airported over. I won't even wait for a jet. This period of development is in Egypt. And the Egyptian heritage by Mark Lehner gives you a background and a history of this thing. That's where he said he developed. This tremendous ability to lay aside consciousness and move, travel in time dimensions. His clairvoyant, his telepathic, his healing ability, but his guidance for people and his ability to tap universal helpful material came out of that Egyptian period. It wasn't even a historical period. He pushed it way back into about 10,000 BC and tied it up with all kinds of strange things that the archaeological work might any day establish as being very accurate, which would blow everybody's mind, including mine. another period that is specifically related to the healing. This was, the Egyptian was when he was Rata, a high priest in Egypt, and in a very prehistoric, ancient time. And then again in Persia, where he was a forerunner of one of the Zoroastrian leaders. His name was Yut in that time, and it was a healing center that was established, and his great interest and his ability, for which he's most famous, the medical clairvoyant, came out of that Persian or Yut period. There is a strange reference in Dad's readings. It's not the only one. There are a number of people. I ran into two others, just quickly looking. It said that he'd run through this cycle in the earth plane, and it'd gone off into space. The symbol of this is going out through Arcturus and then making a decision to come back, whatever that means. Or he's one of those characters. And then a number that have done this, it's a finishing of a development and a choice in relationship to being here. But he said about himself. Now let's look at this business. What kind of range of perception, what kind of psychic gift are we talking about here? Now I'm going to tell you stories, little ones, real fast, and just illustrate. Some of them you will have heard. Some of them you may be hearing for the first time and wonder whether I've made this one up or not, because they're wild. Some of them, I admit it. They're the kind that really fascinate me when I begin to look at the range of these. First ones that have to do with telepathy and clairvoyance. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with these words, the perception. Telepathy as a thought from one person to another, but clairvoyance as being able to see something that is not necessarily in the mind of someone else. For instance, if something's buried in the ground, like a rock of some kind at a particular distance down, nobody knows that. And if you could see it clairvoyantly, that would be clairvoyant, seeing beyond, clear vision, beyond the range of the senses. Harmon Brough tells this story. He was down here during the war years, and Harmon was answering the phone one day while a reading was being given in the reading room down on Arctic Circle, on the little lake down there. Dad's study was right on the lake, and my mother, who was giving the suggestion for the reading, and Gladys Davis, who was writing the reading, were sitting there, and they were getting a reading for a lady who was present that day for it. And in the other office, with two doors closed, Harmon answered the telephone, and Ruth Lenore has allowed me to use her name in this connection. She tells the story herself, so who's a member of Study Group 1, was calling from Charlottesville, Virginia. And she was saying, please ask Mr. Cayce, I've got to get a reading on my daughter. They've phoned me from Williamsburg, where she was in school at William and Mary, and they've taken her to the hospital. I don't know anything about her, but they've taken her to the hospital. I'm leaving right now on a bus, and if he can get an emergency reading for her, I'd appreciate it very, very much. I need it. I don't know what's happened to her. And Harmon explained to her the reading was already being given, and he couldn't interrupt, and so they hung up. And she said, I'll call again as soon as I get to Charlottesville. Now, she knew that her daughter had been taken to the hospital in Williamsburg. Harmon never conveyed that information, never opened either of the two doors. And in the other room, Edgar Cayce finished the reading that he was giving on the woman who was present. And then immediately he started talking again and said, now I have the body before me of Jean Lenore, who is in room so-and-so at the hospital in Williamsburg. There's nothing to be concerned about. She fell from a double-deck bed in her room when playing around and hit the back base of her spine on a lower part of the bed and knocked her out. And she is now has recovered consciousness. A couple of osteopathic treatments later would be helpful, but she'll be able to leave the hospital today. Now, he gave the room number, He mentioned exactly what the accident was. He indicated what she needed for treatment. He never had any suggestion about Jean Lenore. And Mrs. Lenore, who had called her mother, didn't know where she was, what room in the hospital, or what had happened to her. Now, this is very interesting clairvoyance, telepathy, or whatever you want to call it. Now, that's exactly what they found out, that that's what had happened to her. Now, on another occasion, Gladys was sitting, taking the reading, looking out the window there, and writing the reading. She was looking out at the little pier that stuck out into the little lake there. And my father was lying with his head below the window level. My mother was sitting with her back to the window, so she didn't know. And all of a sudden, Gladys saw her young nephew come running across the yard, and he could hardly walk. And he had gotten away from the maid who was supposed to be keeping him. And she became immediately agitated and concerned because she couldn't stop the reading, and he had walked out on the pier. If he fell in, she was going to have to jump up anyway and rush out there and pull him out of the water. She hoped the maid would show up, and she became agitated as she watched the child get closer and closer to the water. Now, she knew and saw what was happening. Suddenly, Edgar Cayce stops in the middle of the reading, in the middle of a sentence, and said, "Go and get the child." And she went and got the child, took her back to the maid. When she came back, he picked up in the middle of that sentence where he had left off and finished the reading. Now, that's telepathy. Sharp, clear, practical, immediate, instantaneous. You see, it kind of blew Gladys's mind. I mean, you see these things happen. You saw them happen for 40 years, and still they raise questions about this perception, this strange business. Now, I was part of a fascinating example of clairvoyance telepathy in a reading. And the reading was being given here in Virginia Beach, and the man had made an appointment and had given the address of his apartment in New York. He was a businessman, and he was going home to be present in the afternoon for the reading and in his apartment. So the address of the apartment was given. And when Dad opened the reading, I was sitting there listening to it, and my mother was taking it, Gladys was recording. He said, "He isn't here." Now, he hadn't gotten to the apartment. He said, he's on his way, and he's praying. He said his car, the taxi he's in, has run into a bus, and he's been delayed. I'll wait for him. And so we sat there in silence for 10 minutes. And he didn't say anything, just lying there. Suddenly, he said, "He's come in now." And I jumped up at that point and left the room and called the man in New York City. Now, I didn't tell him a thing. When I spoke to him on the phone, he was all out of breath. He was saying, "I'm not going to get my reading. I'm late for it. I'm late. I'm not going to get my reading." And he said, I took a taxi home, and it ran into a bus, and he told me exactly what Dad had just finished telling us in the reading. And I reassured him, and he got his reading. Now, again and again, this kind of thing, of descriptions of what was going on at the time. And the outer things that Dad said at times were more convincing to people than the internal parts, because they knew what is happening around them and outside, but they didn't always know what was going on inside of them, though they're unconscious, and they have known very well. Now, another type of extrasensory perception, this psychic gift of Edgar Cayce, was precognition. I was present, and this is a combination of things. You may have read this somewhere, but it's a fascinating story to keep in focus. Precognition is very much a part of what would, in a mass form, would be called a prophecy. But precognition is the observation, of course, in the future of a specific event, more related to a particular situation than to a broad sweeping statement like earthquakes. which is the subject of that Earth Changes update. In 1929, in August of 1929, Edgar Cayce received a telephone call from a man in New York who was president of A.R.E, who was also had a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. And he was buying and selling like mad. And the association had an account, and he was giving money to support both the hospital and the university here, and members of the board were investing with him, and the whole A.R.E was tied up with this fascinating development of this man's dreaming ability to manipulate, work with the stock market. And he was doing very well. And he had a dream. And the dream was he was standing in a crowd of people around a dead figure on the floor. And he recognized the figures as members of the board of the New York Stock Exchange. And the president of the board had a big hypodermic needle. And he was saying to the group, you know, we can't support this any longer. It's dead. And he turned and saw the dreamer. And he said, what are you doing here? You're not supposed to know about this. And he started after him with the hypodermic, and the dreamer ran. And so he didn't understand exactly what that thing was. So he phoned Edgar Cayce and said, will you please help me interpret this dream? And he said, well, it's you know, kind of obvious. This is the market. And now this is in August of 1929. Things were jumping in those years. If you don't remember, everybody was making money in stocks. They were just going higher and higher and higher. And not in the volumes that they are now, but just soaring. And he said, this is indicative of the market. It will be supported for several moons. I don't know why he didn't say months. He said moons. Several months, and then will come a break. Sell everything you own. It will mean the closing not only of the boards in New York, but across the nation. There will be a change in the specie. Sell everything you own. This is a panic. Now, the man got it back. He was busy. It was sent to him, and he didn't believe that the market was going to collapse that soon. And he put it aside. How in the world this happened, neither he nor anybody else knows, because it's clearly written there. Well, you know, it was in October of that year that the market broke, and millions of shares changed hands in one day. The markets did close across the boards, across the nation. We went off the specie. You know, we changed the specie, went off the gold standard. The banks closed. We were in the midst of the Great Depression. And it happened in October, following the August of the several moons or months, where it was to be supported, and then the break. Precognition. Looking ahead. This future is, if you get to the right place in consciousness, is quite observable, and frequently can help you meet and work with situations that you need to be aware of. Now let's look at the other direction in time. Time is not as stable as we think it is. There isn't any really past, present, and future, as you know. And this is one of the things that this whole business of extrasensory perception begins to make us very cognizant of. That time is not what we think it is. And so when you retrocognition, you're going back into the past and picking up something that can be checked. And of course, one of the best ways to check such things is archaeological discoveries. And we don't have many of those. I've been chasing, it takes a lot of time and a lot of money to dig. And we've done a little bit of it, and it's cost us. But we are doing a lot of it because of the tremendous effect of what it would mean if it were absolutely accurate on some major ones. I want to mention one that did come about. When they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, Edgar Cayce had already given, as far as 11 years before, descriptions of the Qumran community where they found pieces of the scrolls, had given them in 90-some-odd readings, just a flock of readings. that he had mentioned the Essenes and the group on the northwest coast of the Dead Sea, just off of the road that goes down to Jericho, which is exactly the description that was used in the New York Times in describing Qumran. After they found the scrolls in the cave, they came down and tried to find out where they were developed and dug up Qumran, or the community of Essenes, which has been identified by most of the scholars now as an Essene community. Everything that Edgar Cayce said about that community has been established since that time by the archaeological work. Now, we didn't have anything to do with that, unfortunately. We didn't get that until after the fact, and they thought we'd made it up. And some of them still think we made it up to fit the occasion. And it's very difficult to deal with these people who are so factual about things of this kind. Now, in this connection, though, there are other individual instances of retrocognition that have proven in some detail to be accurate and made fascinating stories and material. This one has to do with a psychologist, a very well-known psychologist who was published in all the parapsychology journals during his time. In fact, happened to be a gentleman that Dr. Ryan sent here from Duke University to study Edgar Cayce for 10 days, and who became so enamored of the readings that Dr. Ryan thought he had lost his objectivity and liked the readings too much. In fact, he got readings on himself, and that was one of the things that upset him. One of these readings he got was his life reading. And I went over that life reading with him. And he's a clinical psychologist, very well-known gentleman. And he talked about his reading, and I asked him questions about the incarnations, and we got down to this one incarnation that Edgar Cayce had described for him, when he said that he had been connected with the Revolutionary War. And he said, I don't like the Revolutionary War. I like the Civil War, but I don't have anything to do with that Revolutionary War. I said, he's wrong on this one. And we went on and read a little further, and it said that he had trained spies. He was a Tory, and he had trained Tory spies to spy on the American Army. And he'd done this from a big house on Long Island. The British kept control of Long Island most of the war, the Revolutionary War. And he said, this doesn't fit me at all. I just don't like that. And I said, I think you're protesting too much, Lucian. And we laughed about it. And the war came on. We lost track of him. And he died right after the war. And we knew that he had died, but we had just lost complete track of him. I'd been very close to him up until the war years. And everybody got separated, as you remember. And his wife showed up down here. And she said, can I see his reading? I said, sure, and gave her the number. And she came running right back in. It was up at the old building there. We didn't have this big library there. She said, Julian, do you know what happened to this man? I said, no. She said, well, when the war came, he loved the Navy, so he tried to get a commission in the Navy. He loved boats. And said he took they gave him all sorts of battery of tests of every kind. And they agreed to give him a commission, but only if he would work in the intelligence service. Intelligence service? And yeah, he said that, and he spoke French very fluently. So they put him to training the spies that they dropped to assist the French underground back of the German lines in France. And he spoke French fluently, so they put him to work. And she said, more amazing and more coincidental than that, and coincidence can get real stretched at this point. And he did it from a house on Long Island, a big mansion, where he trained all these spies that they were dropping, trained them with French and psychological methods of, communication and whatnot. Well, that's a complete record of this interesting case. What an interesting kind of approach to the angles of this thing. Absolutely fascinating. You would ask, I'm sure some of you know about Uri Geller. I trotted over to Russia to see this lady moving objects, a couple of them moving objects, just thinking about them. Did Edgar Cayce ever move an object? No. Never saw him move anything in his life, except himself once. In this fashion, it happened. He was giving a reading for a doctor, his patient. We had the doctors there and about 50 people sitting around in a room in Long Island, New York. And he was lying on a studio couch that didn't have any head or foot, just stretched out. I was sitting by him. My mother was home sick with my brother, who was small, and Gladys was taking the reading, and all these doctors, everybody was there, and he was in the midst of this reading. I thought doing very well if he had the patient, which I think he did. But he hadn't gotten very far. He was just describing what the person was suffering from and so on. The doctor was nodding, sitting there listening, and I could see him. And suddenly somebody wrote a question and got up and passed it across my father's body. And he stopped talking instantaneously. This led to a real set of discoveries. For the next 30 minutes, I tried to get him to go on. For the next 30 minutes, now an hour passed, I tried to get him to wake up. And he did not move, did not a sign of movement. And I was repeating the suggestions over and over. People got nervous. A lot of them had to leave. And they left. They thought, I don't know what they thought. And suddenly, Edgar Cayce, lying there with his hands across his solar plexus, suddenly began to breathe very deeply, and the diaphragm moved up and down. Deep breaths. And then, with his hands still crossed across his solar plexus, he came to a standing position at the end of the couch in front of all these people. It was as if somebody had put their hand back of his head and set him on his feet like that. He was dizzy, upset, and went out of the room immediately, had to have a cracker and some milk, came back and wanted to know what happened. He has no memory, remember, of any of these experiences, or anything he ever said, or anything that ever happened to him in any of it. It's the closest thing I ever saw to psychokinesis with Edgar Cayce. Communication with the dead, yeah. There's a lot of it in that booklet that was shown you, Kathy showed you this morning, God's Other Door. Edgar Cayce did not advocate trying to communicate unless you needed the survival hypothesis and the communication at a personal level. But now and then, in the readings, apparently he would stop as he came back, traveling on this shaft of light, and in returning to his body, and would stop and talk to people on different levels of consciousness. And you'd hear him talking, but you wouldn't hear them talking. Now, this out-of-body experience, you see, was what was established, in a way, by passing the paper across him. When we asked him what happened later in another reading, he said the final body, the real physical body, is lying just parallel to the flesh body when this entity works. And it's from that platform that the mind takes off to make the attunements for the psychic information. But he was out of body. That is, the final body was out of body. Now, many of you have had out-of-body experiences, I know, where you dream that you're away from your body and you've seen your body. Moody's book, or Life After Life, describes people who die and had these out-of-body experiences. It's a common denominator in the whole field of parapsychological research. A lot of children have these experiences. Kids have them all the time. They're afraid to talk about them because they think the parents will think they're crazy. And sometimes they do think they're a little off when they discuss these things, or imagining, making them up. They're traveling, as Edgar Cayce traveled deliberately for this information. Once, for example, we were in Selma, Alabama, and had finished a reading. And he said, so-and-so is here. And it was my mother's brother who was dead. And he wants to say something. And then he would listen and then repeat what was being said to him from the brother. And the brother was telling my mother, who was sitting right there, that he thought that he was about to be able to incarnate again, that he had been at the home that the grandfather was building when the grandfather died, and he finished it after he died. And it's a state of consciousness, of course, and that he had gone to this home and several of the members of this big family were there. A nice idea if you can arrange to stop on a timeless world, you see. And he went on to describe what he'd been doing, and that gradually some different ones of the family had left, and he knew that they were going on, but that he thought he would be able to go away soon. Very strange business. There's lots of these in the readings. They're indexed under communication upstairs. The drawers of them. The most startling, which happened several different times, was one that I heard once in New York. That Gladys was taking the reading. I was then, my mother again was not there, and I was there. And Dad had finished the reading for someone who was present, and he said, now, we have before us the body of so-and-so, and gave a dress for a woman out in Missouri somewhere. And he said, the condition with the gallbladder or whatever it was, I forget the exact, I didn't look this up, but it needs an operation immediately. She should go ahead with the operation immediately. And you should wire this so she can get on with it. Well, we never heard of the woman. Didn't have any name, didn't have any address, and the reading was gotten back in Dayton, Ohio, where we'd come from. When we got back 2 days later, there was a letter there from the woman asking for a reading and whether she should have an operation or not. And she'd already gotten a telegram from us saying she'd already gotten the reading. Well, we had in a sense, but not a complete reading at all. He just volunteered the information. A psychic, a sensitive. The possibility that he was tuned in to a universal kind of source. He called it the world of thought form. You've heard it called the Akasha, the cosmic mind, the collective unconscious. Dad said a world of thought form. Ability to tune to individuals with telepathy and clairvoyance. A man who sought to serve people. And as it put it, once turned within and found his maker. His ability to select what would be helpful for people. Quality of his psychic gift that is unusual, I think. His strong and constant definition of the psychic is related to the spiritual nature of man. Not something evil, not something wrong, but something that is part of the very spiritual nature itself. The internal consistency of these readings is something that is constantly before us. More important, I think, for us all, as we move on tomorrow and next day in talking about the meditation and prayer and dreaming, the emphasis that is in the readings on the simplicity with which anybody can begin to move inward, to quicken and awaken, if you're ready and need it, this sensitivity of your own for increased awareness, for healing, for creativity, for better communication. He said this must be always guided by, and I quote, the spiritual aspirations, not by imagination or wishful thinking of the entity, or the desire on the part of those who might be aided. Not just that, but a spiritual aspiration. That question of the spiritual source, the dedication to service, the willingness to try to help, rather than put on a show, or make some money, or take an ego trip of some kind. We had an interesting psychic here with us for a while, and it is why we have devoted so much energy and time to making this material available, not only for average people like you and me, and this emphasis on their capacity to turn within and get guidance and help, but also for those who have special psychic gifts. For he gave a lot of information of that kind. And we'll be moving in a more organized fashion toward other psychics before too long. Thank you very much.